Leia Organa stood on the balcony of the Alderaanian palace, gazing across the lush landscape that stretched below, her mind caught in the tension between expectation and ambition. From the time she was old enough to understand the responsibilities of royalty, she had been guided toward statesmanship by her adoptive parents, Bail and Breha Organa. Yet, deep within her heart, another voice whispered. Sometimes, she heard the echoed memory of her birth mother's strength and devotion to justice. A mother she never truly knew, but whose legacy wound its way through her blood like the Force itself. Padmé Amidala. The name carried a significance that once existed behind closed doors, a secret that only recently had opened to Leia when she discovered the truth about her birth parents. There was a piece of her that felt incomplete, imagining what it might have been like to walk alongside that woman who had served the galaxy as queen and then as senator, to share in that unwavering conviction that lit a spark of compassion in all those around her. Although she had grown up carrying the Organa name, the knowledge that the legacy of Padmé Amidala lay just behind the curtain gave Leia renewed purpose. She intended to follow Padmé's political footsteps, to serve the galaxy as a leader and champion of peace, and perhaps even succeed where her mother had been silenced by tragedy and betrayal. She was only 19, yet there were days she felt 1,000 years old. War had already knocked at the galaxy's door, and the countless victims of the Empire's oppression haunted Leia's conscience. She could almost see them in the mists that blanketed Alderaan's valleys each morning. Bail Organa had shielded his daughter from the worst of it, while also ensuring she never turned a blind eye to the injustices that flourished under the Emperor's reign. That dual approach had made Leia both pragmatic and compassionate. She recognized how intricately politics could be woven into corruption, yet she also believed there was no better path than diplomacy for ending tyranny. By the time she officially reached the age to hold senatorial office, she wore that sense of duty around her like a well-fitted gown. On that particular morning, her father found her standing quietly on the balcony, the pale sunlight reflecting off her white gown. She wasn't wearing any regal headdress. Bail had once said her mother Padmé often kept her hair in elaborate configurations, but here Leia's dark brown locks were in a simple style. It was a small rebellion against pomp and ceremony, yet an act of respect for the daily burdens that weighed on her. She felt more herself this way, unadorned and capable of connecting with the everyday people she wished to serve. Bail approached calmly, his footfalls soft, and she turned to greet him with a thoughtful smile. "There's a request for your presence in the central hall," he said, voice fatherly and measured. "A coalition of planetary representatives wants to discuss how best to propose a measure that limits the Empire's power to reallocate local resources." Leia bowed her head slightly, controlling the flicker of indignation that rose at the mention of the Empire. "Thank you, Father. I will address them shortly." He rested a hand on her shoulder. "I know you're committed to this cause, Leia, but let me remind you that everything the Empire sees is through a lens of fear. You show even a glimmer of defiance, and they will label you a threat. Don't let that deter you, but be mindful." She lifted her chin, the light in her brown eyes as unwavering as the dawn. "Isn't that what Mother would have done?" she asked quietly, a faint crack in her voice. "I've read her old speeches, or at least what fragments you could recover. She always believed that the Senate could be a beacon of hope if guided by justice. I want to carry that legacy." Bail's expression softened. He had no answer that would fully satisfy her yearning to connect with a mother she never knew. But he nodded, eyes bright with pride. "You've inherited more of her spirit than you realize." Leia took one last look at the horizon. The day felt like a chapter opening in a story that had begun long before she was born. She turned away, the soft breeze carrying away the longing that stirred inside her, and with a determined step, she made her way inside to face those gathered in the palace's central hall. Within the great chamber, marble floors shone in the brilliant light streaming from high windows, and the representatives from neighboring worlds shifted anxiously on their feet. Although most had worked with Bail in the past, they were not entirely certain what to expect from Leia. She stood before them, shoulders relaxed but bearing an air of authority, just as Padmé once had in the Senate. The hush in the hall suggested that her arrival commanded the respect she deserved, though perhaps some still looked upon her with curiosity. After all, she was young, barely on the cusp of womanhood. Yet she carried herself as if she had been navigating the corridors of power for years. "My friends," she began, voice echoing across the polished stone. "The time has come for a new strategy. We have tried to cooperate with imperial governors to protect our resources, but that path has yielded limited results. If we intend to preserve our citizens' rights, we must carefully draft legislation that makes imperial overreach not just unpopular, but untenable for the emperor's own regional authorities. We need to illustrate how these oppressive policies undermine local economies and hamper trade. Only by shedding light on the negative consequences for the empire itself can we hope to gain leverage." A light murmur rippled through the room, and the representatives listened more closely, some clearly impressed. Leia paused for a breath, scanning each face. "We will propose a new measure in the Imperial Senate. A measure demanding more stringent oversight of resource reallocation. And we will couch it in the terms the Empire often claims to value: efficiency, productivity, and order. The Emperor wants the galaxy to believe that his regime is the sole path to stability. We must demonstrate that if they continue these oppressive practices, they undermine that stability themselves." As she finished, one of the older representatives, a thin-faced man from Sullust, addressed her. "We've tried reason before, Senator Organa. The Emperor seldom responds to logic that does not benefit him directly. What if all our effort goes to waste?" Leia gazed at him calmly. "We don't have another choice. We must try. This might be our last opportunity to effect political change from the inside." She paused, the determination in her voice bright. "And if we fail, then we will consider other avenues. But let us exhaust every political tool first." The man bowed his head, a sign of respect. Around him, others nodded thoughtfully. They still remembered Padmé Amidala, who had once sparked hope through her own impassioned speeches. Though many of them never imagined Padmé's daughter would carry forward the same convictions. Here she stood, determined and radiant. They gave her their tentative endorsements, and a mixture of relief and anticipation swept the hall. Leia excused herself shortly afterward, and Bail stepped up to discuss practical details with the group. Meanwhile, Leia slipped away, her heart heavy with the knowledge that her adoptive father had guided her to this point, just as Padmé's legacy guided her deeper resolve. She walked along the polished corridors, her mind drifting to the scarcities of the rebellion's efforts that she had heard whispered behind closed doors. She knew the rebellion existed, that cells on distant worlds were already fighting the Empire in secret and sometimes out in the open. But if she was to truly follow Padmé's path, she had to commit to the Senate first, to remain the voice of reason and diplomacy until that route was definitively sealed off. Only then, if the Senate proved fully compromised, would she take more extreme measures. Her father's private study was quiet when she entered. The late afternoon sun cast golden rays across the library shelves filled with holobooks, delicate Alderaanian artworks, and a few relics from the age of the Republic. Leia sat at the large desk, which was scattered with a flimsiplast copy of the measure she planned to propose. In the corner of the room, R2-D2 words softly, always seeming to be around the family in times of significance. She looked over the droid, remembering the story that it had once belonged to her birth mother, a companion during her mother's days in the service of the Republic. It felt comforting that the same droid was now with her, as if bridging the gap between her present and her lineage. A gentle knock on the door frame broke her concentration. It was Breha, her adoptive mother, dressed in a flowing gown that rivaled the elegance of the day. Breha stepped closer and laid a warm hand on Leia's cheek. "You remind me of Bail when he first took office," she said, eyes tender. "Yet there is something else about you, something more earnest, something that glows like a flame." Leia took a breath. "I think of her sometimes, the one who came before me. I want to do this for her, as well as for Alderaan and the galaxy." Breha nodded, a wistful smile crossing her face. She knew whom Leia meant. "Just don't forget to do it for yourself as well. Duty is important, but so is preserving who you are beneath it all." Padmé found that balance in her own way. "I believe you can do the same." That night, Leia lay awake in her bed, thoughts swirling with possibilities and uncertainties. She had read so many accounts, some fragmentary, some more detailed, of Padmé's time as Queen of Naboo, her fight against the Trade Federation, and her transition to the Senate. The image of Padmé standing tall, unafraid to speak truth even when the entire galaxy seemed aligned against her, filled Leia with a boldness that she had rarely allowed herself to feel. Whatever came next, she would speak from the same well of conviction. The ghosts of the past might whisper warnings of the Emperor's cunning, but she would let them spur her forward rather than hold her back. Days later, Leia traveled with Bail to the Imperial capital, the city planet of Coruscant. Glistening towers soared upward, each level of the massive ecumenopolis teeming with life of varied forms. The Imperial Palace now rose from the old foundations of the Jedi Temple, a transformation that had always caused an uncomfortable ache in Leia's stomach whenever she glimpsed it in the skyline. Despite not having formal knowledge of the Jedi, she sensed that their legacy had been replaced by something cold and oppressive, a chilling metaphor for the Emperor's rule. Inside the Senate building, she walked with an air of self-possession. Her white senatorial gown was a deliberate choice, reminiscent of the simple style that had once marked Padmé's earliest appearances in the Senate. She had insisted on minimal adornments, focusing instead on the symbolic purity of white that often denoted both peace and resolve. Even the Imperial Guards, standing silent in scarlet uniforms, turned their masked visors to track her passage. Perhaps they were merely following protocol, but Leia felt the unspoken tension. She was the youngest senator in attendance. She was also a daughter of the esteemed Bail Organa, known for his subtle support of rebellious activity. The Empire's watchful eyes would be on her. When she stepped into the Senate chamber, she saw row upon row of floating pods belonging to various member worlds of the Empire. Up high, the Emperor's private dais loomed. She noted that the Emperor himself was absent that day, with Mas Amedda presiding over the day's proceedings. It was just as well. Leia wasn't sure if she was ready to stand under his penetrating gaze, but eventually, she knew it was inevitable. Her father offered a supportive smile from where he stood with other Alderaanian delegates. She gave a brief nod, then lifted her chin and moved forward to speak. As her voice rang through the chamber, the sound magnified by the acoustics, she channeled every bit of confidence she had gleaned from Padmé's recorded speeches. She laid out the new measure, detailing how the Empire's resource reallocation policies were undermining local economies and threatening productivity. Drawing on a precisely composed argument, she framed it in a way that made it sound almost beneficial to the Empire's own goals. Her voice never wavered, but she also did not shrink from the moral imperatives underlying it. "We all understand the need for the central government to maintain order," she said, scanning the assembled senators. "But order does not mean destruction of local autonomy. Efficiency does not mean draining the lifeblood of our contributing worlds. Stability does not mean subjugation of our citizens." There was a palpable hush in the chamber when she finished, and for a moment, Leia could almost feel Padmé's presence. Then scattered applause began, mostly from those rumored to harbor quiet opposition to the Emperor's overreach. Still, some senators sat stony-faced, unwilling to risk alliance with a young idealist who might not survive the Emperor's scrutiny. Mas Amedda offered a terse acknowledgement, stating that the measure would be placed under review. Leia recognized this as a polite brush-off, the typical bureaucratic tactic used to stall legislation that threatened the Empire's status quo. Nonetheless, she left the chamber with her shoulders set in determination. She had played her opening move. Over the following weeks, she and Bail worked tirelessly, lobbying senators privately, trying to galvanize enough support for a formal vote. It was a tedious process, and Leia found herself confronting the intricate web of fear and corruption that snaked through the Senate. Many of these men and women had seen how the Emperor dismantled the last vestiges of the Republic, and they had no intention of being the next target. Others showed mild support but demanded elaborate concessions in return. It was exhausting, but Leia had inherited her mother's tenacious spirit. She found ways to nudge, persuade, and, when absolutely necessary, compromise. Slowly, the measure gained traction, even if it was only in careful whispers. Late one evening, Leia was leaning over a table in a small conference room off the main senatorial offices, scanning a datapad with updated sponsor lists. Bail lingered nearby, watching her intently. "You're doing well," he said softly. "Many of them won't admit it, but they're beginning to take you seriously." Leia sighed, rubbing her temples. "It's not fast enough. Whole worlds are suffering under the Empire's grip. Father, how can I ask them to wait while I jump through bureaucratic hoops?" His eyes were full of empathy. "I know. Believe me, I've asked myself the same question for years. But your mother Padmé believed in the Republic's ideals. She fought for them until the final hour. We continue that fight because there is still a chance, however small, that we can turn the tide from within." She straightened up, shoulders stiff with resolution. "Then we can't give up now." Word of Leia's measure eventually reached the Emperor's circle, and not long after, Leia received a summons, an invitation to meet personally with Palpatine. It was an event that nearly froze her blood. Though she knew that Padmé and Palpatine had once been allies, she also knew how that had all changed after the rise of the Empire. Rumors claimed that Padmé had died under suspicious circumstances around the same time Anakin Skywalker, famed Jedi Knight, vanished. Leia knew the official story: complications during childbirth and heartbreak after the fall of the Republic. But something about the Emperor's casual consolidation of power and the way Padmé had simply slipped from public life never sat well with Bail or Mon Mothma. The man who had once been known as a benevolent senator from Naboo had revealed himself to be anything but altruistic. On the appointed day, Leia arrived at the Emperor's private suite, high in the spires of the old Jedi Temple-turned palace. Dark marble floors reflected the cold light of overhead fixtures. Red-robed Imperial guards stood silent and imposing as they opened the tall double doors leading into the Emperor's receiving chamber. She steeled her composure, stepping forward to where the Emperor sat perched on a high-backed throne-like seat. His skin was pale, his face etched with lines that gave him a twisted, almost inhuman visage. "Senator Organa," he greeted in a voice that hissed softly, tinged with the barest hint of cordiality. "I have been meaning to meet with you for quite some time." Leia bowed respectfully, suppressing the churning in her stomach. "Your Majesty, I am honored by the invitation." He inclined his head, hands folded in his lap. "I've heard a great deal about your measure to curtail the Empire's ability to relocate planetary resources. And I must say, it has stirred quite the conversation in the Senate. I thought I might speak with you personally to better understand your perspective. You know, your mother Padmé once confided in me. We had many conversations during her time as queen and then as senator. She was a dear friend." Leia felt her heart skip, but she kept her face smooth. "Yes, I have studied some of her work. She was remarkable." The Emperor said, his yellow eyes boring into her. "She was. I see some of that same passion in you. And yet, you must understand the galaxy is different now. The Emperor must ensure stability. And for that stability, many sacrifices must be made." Leia's fists clenched at her sides, hidden by the long folds of her gown. "Stability is important," she said carefully. "But at what cost, Your Majesty? If entire worlds are left impoverished, if their citizens lose their livelihoods, will they not resent the Empire in the end?" A thin smile curled on Palpatine's lips. "I admire your willingness to speak so boldly, Senator. But take heed. The Empire does not look kindly upon defiance disguised as debate. I am not an unreasonable man. Show me that your proposal serves the greater good, my good, and perhaps I will not stand in its way." The unspoken threat wrapped itself around the conversation like an icy shroud. Leia took a moment, letting the fear pass through her, then replied, "I will do my utmost, Your Majesty." With that, the Emperor nodded and waved a hand, dismissing her. Leia turned on her heel and walked out, heart hammering in her chest. She could almost feel his gaze trailing after her, like a serpent waiting to strike if she stepped too far out of line. Yet a sliver of hope sparked within her. He had not outright refused the measure. Perhaps, just perhaps, he considered her too small a threat to crush outright. That might be the advantage she needed. In the days that followed, A strange tension hung over the Senate. Some of Palpatine's close allies, such as Sly Moore and Masameta, refrained from interfering with Leia's measure, which only piqued the curiosity of other senators. They began to wonder if the Emperor saw some hidden value in the measure or if Leia had managed to find a secret angle that benefited him. Either way, support began to coalesce. One by one, senators signed on in quiet backdoor meetings. Bail Organa, Mon Mothma, and Gideon Danu all pledged their unconditional support. Others joined because they believed the Emperor had no real stake in shutting down the measure, while some joined because they saw a chance to weaken the Empire's grip. Despite the blossoming coalition, Leia felt uneasy. She didn't trust Palpatine's silence or the new wave of endorsements from certain corners of the Senate known for opportunistic alliances. Nonetheless, she pressed forward, aware that this might be the one fleeting chance to enact meaningful reform. Every day, she felt the invisible presence of her mother's memory urging her onward, a legacy of determined idealism that refused to be extinguished. On the eve of the scheduled Senate debate for final passage of the measure, Leia returned to her quarters on Coruscant, finding them bathed in the neon glow of the endless cityscape beyond her window. She sat on a small couch, scanning through a hollow recording. Its label marked it as part of Padmé's old senatorial addresses. The flickering image of Padmé appeared, standing gracefully at a podium, addressing an assembly. The audio crackled with age, but Leia could hear her mother's conviction as clearly as if she stood in the room. Padmé spoke about the sanctity of democracy, about the need for accountability in governance, about how oppression never led to lasting peace. Though tears pricked Leia's eyes, she listened closely, letting each word settle in her heart. She rewound portions of the speech, trying to memorize the cadence of her mother's voice. It was so comforting and yet so heartbreaking. She realized that she wanted to be worthy of that legacy, to shape the future that Padmé had given her life to protect. The Emperor might plot in the shadows, but Leia would carry on the fight. The following morning, the Senate convened. A hush of expectancy hung in the air as senators filed into their pods, anticipating a pivotal debate. Leia stood beside Bail, outwardly calm though her heart pounded. She inhaled deeply, steeling herself. The measure was introduced, and debate began in earnest. Various senators spoke up, some praising the measure for recognizing the key to lasting prosperity, others decrying it as an unnecessary hindrance to the Emperor's wise rule. Leia took her turn, delivering a speech that wove moral conviction with pragmatic appeal, evoking not just the welfare of the galaxy's people, but also the Empire's stated goals. She pressed every rhetorical lever at her disposal, the memory of Padmé urging her on. When she finished, the applause was louder than she had expected, though she noticed that a contingent of hardline Imperial senators watched her with cold eyes. The vote commenced. Each senator pressed a button on their consoles, casting their planet's share of votes for or against. Leia clenched her fists as the results began scrolling across the massive hollow displays. For a moment, it looked almost too close to call. Then the scale tipped barely. The measure passed by a slim margin. A wave of relief and triumph washed over Leia, and she glanced at Bail, whose face shone with cautious pride. Senators allied with their cause broke into polite applause, while the dissenting senators fumed. Mon Mothma gave Leia a discreet nod of approval from across the chamber. For the moment, it felt like a small but significant victory. Leia had managed to pass a piece of legislation that curbed some of the Empire's more egregious practices, and she had done so within the system, just as Padmé once believed possible. Still, the Emperor had not personally appeared. Rumors rippled that he was preoccupied with other matters, or that he was letting the Senate have a minor victory to quell growing dissent. Leia did not fool herself into thinking that Palpatine would let the matter rest. She fully expected repercussions. Within days, the new legislation took effect. Several Imperial governors expressed discontent, forced to adhere to stricter guidelines on resource allocation. The Empire's official press minimalized the measure, framing it as a slight administrative adjustment. Yet beneath the surface, Leia could sense a shift, subtle but present. Some worlds felt emboldened to push back a little more against the Empire's demands. Whispers of rebellion stirred with renewed hope. Perhaps the Senate wasn't a lost cause after all. It was in this fragile atmosphere that Leia found the path ahead suddenly more precarious. She had to anticipate that Palpatine would find a way to strike back, possibly in a way she couldn't anticipate. Unsurprisingly, it happened about 2 weeks later when Imperial intelligence launched an investigation into suspected treasonous activities among certain members of the Senate. Several mid-level senators who had supported Leia's measure found themselves under scrutiny, or worse, arrested on trumped-up charges. Panic rippled through the Senate. The measure remained in place, but the Emperor's message was clear: step too far out of line and face dire consequences. Desperate to protect the progress she had made, Leia consulted with Bail and Mon Mothma. "We have to do something," she said in a hurried whisper, meeting them in a hidden alcove of the Senate building. "They're rounding up supporters one by one. Soon no one will dare speak against the Empire." Mon Mothma's face was grim. "It's a deliberate purge. Palpatine is isolating you, trying to make sure that your coalition falls apart. We've been through this before, but never at this scale." Bail nodded, brow furrowed in deep concern. "Leia, if this continues, we may need to consider pulling you out. The Emperor has singled you out as a threat. If anything happens to you—" He trailed off. Leia knew what he meant. The Emperor had done far worse to others in the past without a second thought. Leia bristled, recalling her mother's unwavering courage. "I won't be intimidated. If I run now, I'll validate his methods." Padmé would never have fled at the first sign of danger. Mon Mothma laid a gentle hand on Leia's arm. "Your mother also understood the cost. She faced it head-on, yes, but the cost was dear. We can't lose you, too." Leia took a breath, letting the swirl of emotion settle. "We fight this. We use every political mechanism we can to block these arrests and investigations. We shine a light on the injustice of it. If the Empire wants to do this in secret, we don't let them. We make it public, we raise questions in the Senate and the media. We reveal the truth, and we force the Emperor to either come out and defend these actions or back down." Both Bail and Mon Mothma exchanged a look of admiration mixed with apprehension. They agreed to help. Over the next few days, they coordinated a renewed effort in the Senate to question the legitimacy of the arrests, to call for open trials and inquiry committees. Leia gave impassioned speeches on the Senate floor, demanding transparency and accountability, invoking the Empire's own laws and statutes. She forced the Emperor's supporters to either defend the crackdown or remain silent, risking further damage to their already tenuous reputations. The tension ratcheted up. Palpatine remained conspicuously silent, leaving subordinates to deal with the new wave of demands. Meanwhile, rumors spread that the Emperor was personally investigating ways to neutralize Leia. Some whispered about staged accidents, others about political sabotage. Every time Leia left her quarters, she felt eyes on her, as if at any moment, an Imperial operative might arrest her under false pretenses. In the midst of these developments, a figure from the past emerged: Captain Typho, who had once served as part of Padmé Amidala's security detail. Now an older man, living quietly in the underlevels of Coruscant, he managed to contact Leia through discreet channels. She arranged a covert meeting in an abandoned section of the old Senate housing blocks, determined to hear what he had to say. He stood before her, the light of a single overhead lamp revealing the scars of time etched on his face. "I served your mother until the day she died," he said in a hushed voice. "I saw how Palpatine rose to power, how he manipulated everything in the shadows. After the Republic fell, I went into hiding. But I have information, stuff your mother left behind. I think she wanted you to have it." Leia's heart thumped. "Information? What kind?" Typho glanced around nervously. "Records, personal notes, incomplete but possibly revealing. Evidence of Palpatine's involvement in engineering the Clone Wars, perhaps even the final confrontation with the Jedi. Padmé suspected much of this but didn't have the chance to publicize it. If you release it now, it could cause a stir among the Senate and the public. Palpatine's entire narrative about the Jedi betrayal might unravel." Leia's breath caught in her throat. This was huge. If the Emperor's role in the war and the purge of the Jedi were exposed, perhaps the galaxy would realize the depth of the deception. Yet she also knew how dangerous possessing such information could be. It would paint a target on her back larger than ever. "You have this evidence with you?" He nodded. "I've hidden it, but I can get it to you. You must be careful. Palpatine will stop at nothing if he even suspects you have this." Leia nodded. "Thank you, Captain. My mother trusted you, and so will I. I'll make sure this truth is shared with the galaxy." The next day, Leia moved cautiously, meeting Typho in secret to retrieve a small data crystal containing files older than the Empire itself. She tucked it away, heart pounding at the weight of what she now carried. If these files proved legitimate, they could incite open revolt or, at least, spark a serious crisis in the Senate. Before deciding on the best way to utilize the information, she first sought the help of trustworthy allies, Bail, Mon Mothma, a few other senators. In a private session, they viewed the data. There were partial recordings of Palpatine in cloaked meetings, referencing the war's orchestrated nature. There were transcripts of communications that implied direct involvement in sabotage that had fanned the flames leading to the Jedi Temple attack. Though not a smoking gun in every detail, it was devastating enough to raise severe questions about the official story. Mon Mothma's eyes shone with a fierce determination once she finished reviewing the evidence. "If we leak this, it could change everything." Leia's hands shook slightly. "Yes, it could also cost lives. The Emperor will respond harshly." Bail pressed his lips together. "What do we do?" Leia exhaled, reminding herself of Padmé's courage. "We do exactly what Mother would have done. We bring it to the Senate floor. We demand a formal investigation. The Emperor can't simply dismiss it if we present it with enough eyes watching. The galaxy deserves to know the truth." So it was decided. They set about planning the reveal carefully, orchestrating leaks to a few sympathetic Holonid journalists, preparing for maximum exposure. The day of the Senate session arrived, and Leia took the floor with trembling resolve. This time, she was not proposing a measure or calling for reform. She was exposing what she believed was the Emperor's darkest secret. She began with a calm introduction, then laid out the evidence piece by piece, displaying relevant images and quotes on the Senate's central holoprojector. Gasps rippled through the assembled pods. Some senators shouted for order, others for immediate condemnation of Palpatine's alleged crimes. A wave of shock swept the chamber. Whether genuine or feigned, Leia could not be certain. She felt sweat bead on her forehead, but she pressed on, concluding with a demand for a formal tribunal to examine the newly uncovered evidence. The uproar was immediate. Loyalist senators hurled accusations at Leia, calling the data forged, claiming she was leading a rebellious conspiracy. Those who already distrusted the Emperor rose to her defense. It was chaos. The presiding official, Masa Meta, struggled to restore order, his voice drowned out by the clamor. For the first time in years, the Senate erupted in something akin to raw debate, echoes of the old Republic days when senators had not yet been cowed into submission. Finally, the chamber quieted enough for Masa Meta to speak. His voice was icy with outrage. "These are grave allegations, Senator Organa. The Emperor will address them in due course, but for now, the session is adjourned." He slammed a gavel-like device, cutting off further discussion. The massive doors opened, and an exodus of frantic senators poured out, private conversations swirling. That night, Leia received a summons to the Emperor's presence. There was no polite veneer this time, simply a direct order. She arrived flanked by Bail and Mon Mothma, only to be told they would not be permitted inside. Imperial guards confiscated her comlink and escorted her alone into Palpatine's private hall. The doors sealed behind her. She stood before the Emperor, whose face was cast in deep shadow. "You dare bring such lies before the Senate?" he hissed, voice reverberating with menace. "You, the daughter of Padmé, who once placed her trust in me?" Leia forced her shoulders back, meeting his gaze. "They are not lies. Your facade is cracking, Your Majesty. It's time the galaxy learned who truly brought about the Clone Wars and the demise of the Jedi." His eyes narrowed to slits. "Such pride, such courage. It is wasted on the Senate. You could have done so much good under my guidance, but you persist in this folly. You do not realize what power truly is." He rose from his seat with a surprising agility, stepping closer until she could see the faint network of veins beneath his papery skin. "Your mother was a fool," he whispered, venom lacing each word. "She believed in democracy, in the inherent goodness of people. But she was always meddling in matters she did not comprehend. Cost her everything. And now you walk the same path." Rage ignited in Leia's chest, but she fought to remain composed. "My mother was no fool. She saw through you. She wanted the galaxy to know the truth. And I will finish what she started." A low, mirthless chuckle escaped Palpatine's lips. "You cling to illusions. The Senate is under my control. Your precious measure is meaningless without my blessing. I allowed it to pass to see how far you would go. You will not leave this chamber with your cause intact unless you submit." Leia felt a flicker of fear. She was unarmed, alone with no guarantee of rescue. But she remembered Padmé's own bravery in confronting injustice, how Padmé never faltered even under threat of war. Summoning that same fire, Leia leveled her gaze at Palpatine. "I will not submit," she said softly but firmly. In that moment, Palpatine snarled, and Leia felt an unseen force clutch at her throat, constricting her airway. She gasped, knees buckling. The Emperor's eyes burned with malevolence. Here was the rumored power that had vanquished the Jedi, laid bare. She fought for breath, her vision hazing as she clawed at her neck. But just as quickly, the hold loosened, and she collapsed to the floor, gulping air. Palpatine loomed above her. "Consider this a lesson," he spat. "You speak of your mother's path, but you forget her final fate. I can crush you as easily as I did the Jedi. And if you continue to defy me, I will." Leia struggled to her feet, ignoring the throbbing pain in her throat. A spark of defiance still glimmered in her eyes. "You can kill me," she rasped, "but you cannot kill the truth." The Emperor's laugh was a bitter hiss. "We shall see." He gestured to the guards, who seized Leia's arms. She was dragged out of the hall, every fiber of her being trembling. When she emerged, Bail and Mon Mothma rushed forward, horror etched into their faces at the sight of her, bruised and gasping. The guards relinquished her to them, and she felt faint, though she managed to remain on her feet. Bail placed a supportive arm around her. "Leia, are you?" She nodded stiffly. "I'll live." But the haunted look in her eyes spoke volumes. She had come face to face with the Emperor's fearsome power, a monster who would strike without mercy to protect his regime. By the time dawn broke over the dark spires of Coruscant, word had spread of Leia's confrontation with Palpatine. Whispers from staff members and rumors from the guard detail circulated among the Senate, igniting a mixture of fear, admiration, and concern. Some senators moved to distance themselves from Leia, terrified of the Emperor's wrath. Others, especially those who had wavered before, found renewed respect for her resolve. Yet Leia knew her position was perilous. Palpatine would almost certainly orchestrate a way to discredit her. She needed to act fast if the revelations about the Clone Wars were to gain traction. Over the next week, she worked tirelessly with Bail, Mon Mothma, and their closest allies, pushing for a formal inquiry, releasing the data widely across the holonet so that even if the Senate refused to act, the public could see it. Palpatine's propaganda machine kicked into overdrive, painting the files as doctored, blaming the rebels or foreign saboteurs. Meanwhile, arrests continued. The Empire tightened its grip on the galaxy. Stormtrooper presence increased in countless systems, reinforcing the underlying message: the Emperor would tolerate only so much. Yet with each crackdown, more disillusionment spread among the people. The seeds of open resistance were sown, and the rebellion's ranks swelled in secret. Leia understood now that her mother's path, though anchored in politics and diplomacy, had ultimately been about unwavering moral clarity, even under the threat of tyranny. With the Senate nearly paralyzed by fear, Leia recognized she would eventually have to choose between staying in the imperial political structure and joining the rebellion in earnest. But for the moment, there was still a spark of hope in the old halls of the Senate, a spark that Leia had managed to fan into a flicker of possibility. She recalled how Padmé once said that liberty dies with thunderous applause. Now, Leia wanted to flip that story. If tyranny was born in applause, perhaps truth could rise in a chorus of voices that refused to be silenced. Days turned into weeks, and the battle of wills between Leia and Palpatine intensified. The Emperor made a few carefully orchestrated public appearances, framing Leia's actions as rash accusations from a misguided upstart. He praised loyalty and threatened dissidence in the same breath, while Leia spoke out when she could, her presence amplified by sympathetic media. The measure she had passed remained on the books, somewhat curtailing resource exploitation, but the Empire found loopholes daily. Some of Leia's supporters argued that they had achieved a symbolic victory but little else. Still, Leia refused to lose heart. Every day that the Emperor was forced to respond to her claims was a day that his iron grip loosened, if only a fraction. Bail Organa watched his daughter with cautious pride and a sliver of heartbreak, remembering how Padmé had once fought such battles, how the outcome had been devastating. Each time he saw Leia step into the Senate chamber, regal and resolute in her white gown, he was reminded of the child he had held as a baby, whom he had pledged to protect. He dreaded the moment she might stand at a crossroads, forced to leave politics behind because of Palpatine's inevitable clampdown. Yet for now, he let her blaze the trail she was destined to walk, for he believed the galaxy needed her light. An unspoken question lingered over everyone who watched Leia's rise. Could she succeed where Padmé failed? Could she leverage the Senate for genuine change? Or would Palpatine's tyranny ultimately crush her and all who rallied to her side? The answer lay somewhere in the tides of time and the hearts of countless beings across the galaxy. Some who still believed in the ideals of the Republic, others who cowered behind the false shield of imperial order. Leia, for her part, found a strange tranquility in her purpose. She sensed the memory of her mother in every corridor of the Senate building, in every passion-fueled speech, in every quiet conversation with a desperate senator who dared to hope. Yes, the threat was real, the Emperor's power absolute, but perhaps not eternal. Standing at the same dais where Padmé once stood, Leia delivered address after address, weaving truth, compassion, and an unbreakable commitment to justice into each word she uttered. For the first time since the rise of the Empire, the Senate felt alive with debate, if only sporadically and under watchful eyes. As the weeks became months, Leia's measure to limit resource exploitation bore modest fruit. Some local governors found themselves legally obliged to negotiate fairly with planetary leaders, and the crackdown slowed in those regions. Yet in other areas, the Empire intensified its militaristic approach, determined to show that defiance would not go unpunished. The rebellion, sensing an opening, escalated covert operations. Leia discovered through private channels that various cells looked to her speeches for hope, calling her the voice in the Senate. She neither publicly endorsed nor condemned their actions, mindful of the delicate balancing act she performed. She continued to operate in the Senate, precisely because the Emperor had not yet dared arrest her openly. Behind the scenes, however, plans were brewing. Mon Mothma increasingly spoke of forming an official alliance of rebel cells, a structured, interplanetary rebellion that could stand against the Empire. Bail confided in Leia his fears that Palpatine might dissolve the Senate altogether if she pressed too hard. But Leia, standing amidst a swirl of data transmissions and political pressure, insisted that hope remained. She had to believe that if they turned enough senatorial and public opinion, Palpatine would lose the backing he needed to maintain his dictatorship. Then came the day that set the final pivot in motion. In an act of brazen brutality, the Empire destroyed a small Alderaanian relief station orbiting a remote world, claiming it harbored rebels. Innocent medical staff and patients died in the ensuing explosion. Furious, Leia demanded immediate accountability, bringing forth evidence to the Senate floor that the station had been strictly humanitarian. She called it a crime, even implicating high-ranking Imperial officers in ordering the strike. Her speech reverberated through the chamber, raw with personal grief and righteous fury. Bail, standing behind her, trembled with controlled outrage. They waited for the official response. Instead, the Emperor's presence flickered across a massive holo projection in the Senate. He gazed down at her with a supreme air of contempt. "Senator Organa," he intoned, "your repeated attacks on the Empire's honorable intentions can no longer be tolerated. You are hereby stripped of your senatorial position, pending further investigation into your treasonous activities. All committees under your direction are dissolved." The shock was immediate and absolute. Murmurs and gasps rippled through the Senate. Leia felt as though a blow had knocked the wind out of her. But she steadied herself, turning to look at Bail and Mon Mothma, whose expressions mirrored her own shock and anger. If she was formally stripped of her office, any shield of legitimacy she had left was gone. Palpatine was done playing the game of half measures. A flurry of protests broke out from senators allied with Leia, demanding a proper hearing, accusing the Emperor of overreach. Loyalist senators countered with calls for her arrest. The Emperor's giant holographic figure watched impassively, the barest hint of a twisted smile on his lips. Leia realized that this was the moment she had always dreaded. The Senate no longer served as a platform for justice. Palpatine had shown his hand, making it clear that any threat to his authority would be eliminated. Bail placed a protective hand on Leia's shoulder. "Come," he whispered urgently. "We need to leave this place." Mon Mothma nodded, her face set with determination. They made their way out of the chamber, ignoring the clamor behind them. Within hours, news spread across the holonet that Leia Organa had been removed from the Senate, effectively exiling her from official politics. Stormtroopers moved to secure any offices or documents tied to her. She found herself under watch, if not outright arrest. She retreated to the Alderaanian consulate, guarded by her father's personal security detail, her mind racing with questions about what came next. That evening, as she stood in the quiet gardens of the Alderaanian consulate, glancing at the distant lights of Coruscant's endless cityscape, Leia felt strangely calm. She remembered standing on Alderaan's balcony, thinking about Padmé's legacy. She had tried to honor it by following her mother's political path, seeking to transform the Empire from within. She had achieved some measure of success, a measure that gave the galaxy a glimpse of hope, but not enough to dismantle Palpatine's tyranny. Now that door was closing. Her father approached from behind, his robes rustling against the manicured foliage. "Leia," he said softly, "I'm so sorry. I wish." She turned to him, eyes bright with unshed tears. "Father, I did everything I could. Now the Emperor is free to do whatever he wants without my voice in the Senate. I failed." "No," Bail countered gently. "You have not failed. You gave people something to believe in again. You reminded them that speaking the truth matters. Your mother would be proud." Leia looked away, blinking back tears. In her mind, she pictured Padmé standing with quiet dignity in a Senate far different from this one, fighting corruption and championing democracy. If Padmé had lived to see this day, Leia wondered if she would have given her a gentle smile and reminded her that politics is but one battlefield. A senator's voice could carry far, but it was not the only way to enact change. As the night deepened, a figure emerged from the shadows of the garden. It was Mon Mothma. She approached with a solemn expression. "Leia, Bail, there's something I must discuss with you. The time for half measures is over. We plan to form an alliance of rebel cells, a formal rebellion, and we need leadership. The Senate is compromised, but the people are not. Your position as a senator may be gone, but your ability to inspire remains." Leia inhaled, feeling the weight of the choice before her. She realized in that instant that Padmé's legacy wasn't just about political office. It was about fighting for what was right in whatever capacity one had left. Padmé had done it through the Senate, right until the last moments of her life. Leia would do the same, albeit from a different vantage point. "I will help in any way I can," she said softly, her voice trembling with renewed conviction. "Let's do it. Let's unite the rebellion." Bail nodded, eyes misty with resolve. Mon Mothma offered a slight, grateful smile. The path ahead was fraught with danger, but it was also rife with possibilities. No longer would Leia be confined to senatorial protocols or legislative maneuvers. She would carry Padmé's spirit into the fight for freedom itself, forging alliances with rebels on countless worlds, using her diplomatic skills and moral authority to galvanize resistance. If Padmé had once sparked hope in the Senate, then Leia would become the beacon that carried that hope across the galaxy, shining far beyond the Senate walls. Her days as Senator Leia Organa might be over, but in truth, her work was only just beginning. She had given the galaxy a taste of resistance through words and politics. Now she would carry that torch into the hidden corners and rebellious hearts yearning for liberation. She silently pledged to honor her mother's memory in every action she took, believing that the spirit of Padmé Amidala would guide her forward. And though the Emperor might attempt to crush that spark, Leia knew that hope, once kindled, was far more difficult to extinguish than any voice in the Senate. So ended one chapter and began another, as Leia Organa, daughter of both Alderaan and Naboo, stepped fully into the role for which destiny and lineage had prepared her. She would continue to forge a path, grounded in Padmé's courage, drawing strength from the legacy of a mother she never knew but felt in every fiber of her being. And the galaxy, teetering between tyranny and freedom, would never be the same.